Okay, so we are discussing this transformation now, Martensite transformation. And with regard to this, we have discussed some of the relevant concepts. And one of the most important of them is this shape deformation that is caused by this particular transformation. And we have also understood as to how this FCC structure can change to the BCT structure with some coordinated movement of atoms, okay? And that is through a phenomenon called band distortion, which will give rise to a tetragonal lattice from the FCC lattice, okay? So if you compress it along the c-axis and extend it along the other two, then you can generate a tetragonal lattice which is pertinent to the Martensite phase. Okay. So this is something that we discussed in the last class. But the question to be asked here as to whether this crystal structure which is obtained here, that is depicted in this second diagram over here, in this crystal cell, in this unit cell over here, whether this represents the correct structure of Martensite or not. Okay. So that brings us to the question whether bend distortion alone is sufficient to explain the entire transformation, the entire Martensite transformation. And for that, we need to first see the orientation relationship between austenite and Martensite. The Martensite phase is forming from the austenite phase as you cool it down, and therefore there must have some relationship, some crystallographic relationship between the austenite lattice and the Martensite lattice. Okay. So now if you again look at these two diagrams, FCC and BCT, one belonging to austenite and other belonging to Martensite. Okay. So as we have seen, the c-axis remains the same, right? This one here and this one here are the same directions, right? So therefore, we can say that 001 direction in austenite, that is the c-axis, is parallel to 001 direction in Martensite, right? That is obvious from here. What else? I mean, which other directions are parallel here between these two cells, these two unit cells? You would find that the following are parallel to each other. Can we see it from these two diagrams? Where is the 1 bar 1 0 in the austenite cell? 1 bar 1 0 is along this. And you can see that 1 0 0 is this one, these two sides basically, right? 1 1 0 of austenite, that is along this phase diagonal, right? That is parallel to 0 1 0 of Martensite, which is here, right? So this is due to the bend distortion. So this is basically the bend orientation that we are talking about. People have also found other type of orientation relationship between these two phases. For example, this Wasserman Nishiyama orientation relationship. Then a related one known as Kurchimov Sachs orientation relationship, that is also there. Okay. So these are basically in terms of some directions or some crystal planes in austenite being parallel to some direction or some planes in martensite. Okay. But these are not as simple. I mean, the way it is shown and written over here, when it is experimentally found, these are not as simple like this. Okay. Not in terms of these low index planes or directions which are parallel to each other. The experimentally observed ones are actually more complicated in the sense that these numbers are not rational numbers. So these planes and directions are not exactly parallel, but approximately parallel to each other. So this orientation relationship that you have between austenite and martensite, those are found to be irrational. And in order to understand the Martensite transformation completely, we need to understand this as to why it is so, why it is irrational. This also tells you that a simple homogeneous deformation like the bend distortion is not enough to transform austenite into martensite. Otherwise, this orientation relationship that you see here would have been true experimentally also. So there is something else that we need to consider. Okay. So in this lecture, we are going to understand all that. I mean, we are going to answer this question as to why this relationship, these orientation relationships are irrational. And as we go along, we will see few more concepts and maybe few more questions that we need to answer. And once we do that, you will find that this transformation can be explained with the help of all that, and we can also explain all the characteristics of martensite through the theory that we are going to discuss in this context. Okay. So let us first answer this one question that has come up now as to why these orientation relationships are irrational. So we'll answer that question, but before that we need to understand something about this shape deformation. I mean, these are all interconnected. So if you have a crystal like this, it will have its own atomic arrangement in a particular pattern. And on this crystal, if I apply a shear stress, then we know this is going to change the shape in a manner something like this. Okay. And in metal crystals, this shape change, this macroscopic shape deformation that you see here comes through motion of dislocations in the lattice along specific planes in specific directions. Okay. And this causes something called slip, which is nothing but sliding of crystal blocks over each other. So one part of the crystal will slip over another part, and the line between the slipped and unslipped portion of the crystal is known as a dislocation. Okay. So this is something like that. If one part of the crystal slips over the other, then it creates a slip step. And as I said, this is caused by passage of dislocations along a particular plane which is over here. That plane is known as the slip plane. Okay, and this is occurring in a particular direction, that is the slip direction. So many such dislocations can move over parallel slip planes. So you can have more such steps coming up through the motion of dislocations, motion of many dislocations over several slip planes which are parallel to each other. And you can see that this brings about that macroscopic shape deformation, like what you have seen here, right? So that can be generated through motion of dislocations along the slip planes, which creates these slip steps, and through the motion of several such dislocations over parallel slip planes will cause this shape deformation like what you see that happens through shear. Right, so in metals, this plastic deformation occurs in this manner. Okay, but this does not lead to any change in the crystal structure. This only changes the shape. Okay, but here in case of Martensite transformation, we are talking about a shape deformation which leads to a change in the crystal structure. That's the difference here. Okay, so in case of Martensite transformation, we have a deformation which could change the crystal structure, and it has been found that that particular strain which is causing this change from austenite to martensite, leading to a change in the crystal structure, is a combination of a volume change, that is a dilatation along a particular direction, and a shear. Okay, so if this is the parent crystal of austenite, here you have a dilatation along this direction, that is perpendicular to this plane, and a shear. So this dilatation that you have, that is perpendicular to this plane over here, this interface on which the martensite is growing from the austenite. So this plane, this interface plane, is known as the habit plane of martensite. So this is another term that you need to get familiar with when you talk about Martensite transformation. Okay, so this is the habit plane, which is nothing but the interface plane, the interface between the austenite and the martensite. So the martensite grows across this interface plane. Okay, so this dilatation that you have, that is perpendicular to the habit plane, and the shear is parallel to that, and the strain which causes the martensite to form from the austenite phase is a combination of these two. So that would be something like this. If I combine this delta and this shear S, then a combination of these two would be this one, right? Something like this. So this is the delta, and you have a shear along this direction which is parallel to this habit plane. So the strain that we have, if we call that as P, That's a combination of these two, S and delta, right? And that is this one that you see in the third diagram. So this strain that you have, the strain that is causing the austenite to transform to martensite, is a strain which leaves one plane unchanged. This leaves a plane invariant. There is no change across that plane. It remains undistorted after this strain. And what is that plane? That plane is nothing but this habit plane, which remains undistorted and unrotated. That plane remains invariant. Okay, and therefore this strain is an invariant plane strain. IPS. Okay, we are going to connect all this, just note down all such terms now that we are getting introduced to. As we connect all these, you will see how the mechanism of Martensite transformation can be beautifully explained by the concept that we have been discussing about. Okay. So this is a strain which leaves behind one plane invariant. Okay. So this is an invariant plane strain. Okay. Now what happens in case of the Martensite transformation? You have the austenite phase, and the Martensite is growing from that with a corresponding shape change. Okay, and this is the plane on which Martensite is growing. That is the interface plane, right? That's the interface plane or the habit plane. So this is a displacive transformation which is occurring here. We have already discussed it. And if this is unconstrained, if there is no constraint given by the surrounding matrix that you have around this plate of Martensite which is forming, then the interface plane is going to remain like this. It is going to remain flat. Okay. But if it is constrained, then there will be lot of strain that will be generated around the surrounding matrix, right? So in order to reduce that strain, in order to minimize the strain energy, the Martensite would try and grow as a thin plate. So this interface would assume some curvature. Okay. But the overall plane will remain parallel to this flat plane. It will remain same as the flat plane. So this is the constrained case where there will be strain generated in the surrounding matrix, and in order to minimize that strain, it will take up this kind of geometry as thin plates, and the habit plane will also have some curvature, but the overall plane remains the same as the previous case. It is this plane going into the plane of the paper. Surrounding is austenite. We are going to talk about that as to why, if it takes a thin plate kind of morphology, how does it reduce the strain? We are going to see that. But for the time being, just understand that if it takes up a geometry like that, the strain is going to reduce. The strain energy will be minimized for such a morphology. Okay. So now we have defined the habit plane, which remains invariant. This plane remains unchanged. Okay. So the Martensite here is forming diffusionless, right? We have already seen that. So there is no thermal activation here as a driving force. Therefore, the Martensite phase has to grow by the movement of this interface, right? And therefore, along this interface, you have to maintain a high level of continuity. And coherency. It has to be a coherent interface. It has to remain unchanged. Okay. So the condition for the Martensite transformation is that at least one line along this interface should remain unrotated and unchanged. So it requires that at least one line along the interface must remain unchanged. It should be undistorted and unrotated. The length should remain the same and it should not rotate. This is a must. This is a condition for the Martensite to form from the austenite phase. What does it mean? A line is remaining unchanged. That line is invariant. Okay. So it means that for the Martensite transformation to occur, we need an invariant line strain. Another term that we get introduced to here, that is invariant line strain, ILS. Okay. But remember what I said before. I said, the habit plane remains unchanged. It's an invariant plane strain. The strain which causes the Martensite to form is an invariant plane strain. That is what is actually observed experimentally. But what I am saying now, that it's an invariant line strain and that is must for the Martensite to form. But what is observed is an invariant plane strain. It has been observed, experimentally that the habit plane of Martensite remains undistorted and unrotated. It remains unchanged after the transformation, right? But that cannot form the Martensite, but still it is observed. The one that can form Martensite is an ILS, is an invariant line strain. So there is a discrepancy. So this is the second question that we need to address. At why is this discrepancy? The Martensite will form only when it is an invariant line strain, but what is observed is an invariant plane strain. The habit plane is found to remain unchanged. So why is this discrepancy? So this is the second question that we need to answer. Okay, and we'll do that going forward. And once we do that, you'll see that how nicely we can explain this whole transformation. Okay. But before I do that, let me come back to the first question that we asked. We haven't yet answered this actually. But now that we have come to this invariant line strain and also understood how it is observed as an invariant plane strain, I think we are at a stage where we can answer this question. So maybe in next 5 minutes I will do so. Okay. So we have seen that the Bain strain can change the austenite lattice into a BCT lattice, okay, from a FCC to a body-centered lattice. And what have we done in that case in Bernstein? We have a compression along C-axis and extension along the other two. Okay. So now, in order to understand this bend distortion in little more detail and come to this question, to answer this question, we can consider the austenite phase as a sphere, okay, something like this. So these are the two diameters, AB and CD. So now if I do this on this sphere, compression along the C-axis and extension along the other two, what is going to happen to this sphere? It is going to turn into an ellipsoid of revolution. It is going to become like this. Due to the bend distortion, right? And what happened to those two lines that we had drawn, AB and CD? Do they remain unchanged, unrotated? No, right? So AB was here, and due to this deformation, due to this bend distortion, AB has shifted to this. It is rotated to this place now, A dashed, B dashed, right? And CD is shifted to this, C dashed and D dashed, all right? So here it is not an invariant line strain, right? Because these lines are not remaining unchanged. I mean, they are not remaining unrotated. The length is still the same, but it is rotated. So it is not entirely unchanged. It is not invariant line anymore, okay? But now if I do this, if I apply a rigid body rotation in this manner through an angle like this, then what is going to happen to this CD line? Let us see that, okay? So you could see that if I do this rigid body rotation by this angle, this C dashed D dashed is going to coincide with CD, isn't it? So that is been shown here through this red line. So therefore, we can say that at least one line, that is CD, is remaining invariant if we combine a rigid body rotation with bend distortion. Now, the relationships, the orientation relationships that we derived, that was based upon this, from this to this, okay? But now I have given a rotation. So therefore, those orientation relationships are no more valid here. If I give a small rotation to this now, this will change, right, by a small amount. So this rotation is not big, it's a small rotation. So that rotation will be affected here also in these orientation relationships, and now this will change to something which will come up as irrational. If you add those small rotations here, these indices will change and come out as irrational numbers. And that is why when you experimentally observe it, you find this as irrational, these orientation relations. So I think we have been able to answer this question now. And we have also seen that, this one is an invariant line strain, right? One line is remaining unchanged here. And this is correctly predicting the experimentally observed structure of martensite. So remember what I said, we need a line to be invariant for this transformation to occur. And you can see that this combination of bend strain and a rigid body rotation is actually coming up with that. So this will generate the correct crystal structure for martensite. And through this we can also answer this question as to why the orientation relationships are irrational, right? So one question we have answered today. We have asked another question as to why that discrepancy ILS versus IPS. That is something that we are going to answer next, and as we do that, it will become more clear. I mean, the mechanism of the Martensite transformation will become clear to us. Okay. So with this today, I stop here, then we'll come back to it in the next lecture.